I want to talk to you about your book that you've written, A Proposal for a World Constitution based on the works of Shrii Ranjan Sarkar. So, Chandra Shekhar, it's really, I'm pleased to have you here. And, it would be great if you could just begin by just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, my pleasure. I live in Florida. I'm retired now after a career involving law and education, higher education. And so I was very happy to be able to do this book on a world constitution, partially because of my law background, but also because it's something that P.R. Sarkar himself had actually suggested that I do, which was a very meaningful thing for me. I've been involved in non-market meditation for 52 years now. I got initiated in my sophomore year in college, and I've enjoyed the ride. So it's really great to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again. So, would love to talk to you about some of the, I did get to read the book. Thanks for sending that to me. What an incredible read. Every high school civic student should have the opportunity to read that book. I thought it was very, I know, just it actually led to me to enrolling in a language class here in Hawaii, a local language, because you had talked about the preservation of language
Oh,
in
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Indigenous
So,
languages, right.
yeah. So thank you.
Sure. Well, it
So,
was interesting because this book draws from a wide range of sources of discourses from P.R. Sarkar and attempts to weave them together because he did talk about the idea of creating a world government and having a world constitution to give guidance to that government. You know, a government is essentially a something that has political authority over all of the people of the world, and a world constitution is essentially the guidebook of rules and regulations that the government would follow to be able to provide service to the people. So it's really interesting to try to draw from many different sources to put this together.
you just talked a little bit about what is a world government and a world constitution. Why do you think P.R. Sarkar spoke and wrote about the concept of world government and world constitution?
You know, and it's very interesting. I mean, here we have a spiritual guru, spiritual philosopher, talking about world government, and it seems quite strange at the beginning. Uh, and what's also interesting is that he talked about these principles of world government very early on in his writings in the 1950s. And so you really think about why is that, and what place does this have in his philosophy? One thing that's clear is that in the 1950s, people remembered the horrors of World War II. And a lot of people were concerned about finding ways to prevent that from happening again. So there were a number of world constitutions and ideas for world governments around the world being talked about at that time. Uh, we know from stories about his life that Pierre Sarkar was talking to colleagues during World War II about the atrocities to both civilians, especially to civilians, that were occurring. And it seemed that that clearly affected him. And so that was probably something of an impetus, but also he had been evolving philosophy that would help people look broader, to go beyond the traditional isms that people, you know, lived with, which were in effect almost dogmas that would limit their thinking. Things like nationalism, that nationalism was the most important thing, my country over all others. Or in India, casteism, where one caste was seen as superior to another, and it divided people and made it a very disunified kind of society. And so he was very keen on the idea of universalism, where we look at and care for and love all created beings in the universe. And so I think that part of his desire to promote a world government was to be able to create a universalistic sentiment among the people, where we all feel like we're in this together. We are one people of the planet Earth, and not just people, but we have connections with other life. We are not just humans better than animals, but we're all living beings, all coming from a similar supreme source. In other words, the spiritual philosophy that P.R. Sarkar developed and the spiritual practices clearly emphasize the unity of all, whether it's people, animals, plants, and even inanimate objects. His philosophies really suggest a treatment of all of those with a sense of reverence. So I think that that's, that combination of the aversion to the horrors of war plus the desire to promote this sense of universalism, unity among all beings, both showed up and I think influenced him going in this direction, which at first blush would seem surprising. But if you have a society where everything is divisive and people are at odds with each other, wars are happening, it becomes very difficult for people to pursue spiritual goals very effectively.
I think the concept of universalism is so important. I'm glad you brought that up. And so I think you covered my next question was going to be how do these concepts fit into other aspects of P.R. Sarkar's philosophy? Is there any more that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit to add. I mean, I think the foundation of all of his philosophy is spiritual, that people are striving to find their connection with the supreme entity, the creator, the divine, whatever people would say, that the spiritual part of life is really key, but it's not the only part of life. And two of the other major philosophical uh, uh, elements in Shrii Sarkar's work, P.R. Sarkar's work, is one of them is called NeoHumanism. You may be touching on it in other programs during the PLT, which is dealing more with sort of the mental or psychic world, which helps people overcome limiting dogmas that prevent them from thinking broader, from seeing that unity, from pursuing the connection with all life, the love for all life, even inanimate objects. And that this psychic or spiritual, mental type of philosophy provides a very helpful link to the universalism, which is clearly a part of the world government and world constitution. The government and constitution are meant to promote that, but they themselves are influenced by the concept of universalism, as is found in neo-humanism. And then the other piece of philosophy, which is very influential in the world government and world constitutional context, is the progressive utilization theory, also called PROUT, which you probably will cover in some classes, which is a socioeconomic philosophy meant for the emancipation of humanity. And what it is trying to do is to promote a society where people's needs are met, where the managing of the physical world, including the social interactions and economic interactions, is managed in a way that is conducive to people being able to pursue their uh, spiritual goals, as opposed to a society that really detracts from that, which is much of what we have now.
Yeah, those are 2, yeah, and we do cover both those topics. We have had some classes on them and some live sessions, workshops, and also our anchor course, our 99 Days to Transform the World. We actually do have full modules on both NeoHumanism and Prout that are available and open. So yes, thank you. I think that's really important to bring up.
As people learn more about that, they will see, although the world constitution and world government, I think, is probably closest associated with the Prout philosophy, although it is influenced by both the spiritual and neo-humanist philosophies. But as people learn about those things, they will clearly see how all of those philosophies influence the direction and the structure of world government.
So we started talking about the world government and constitution, and would the world government and constitution evolve over time?
Yeah, I think that this is an interesting point. One thing that P.R. Sarkar, I think, is very aware of is sort of the psychology of people and how introducing a new concept, and this is not just in the context of world government, but in many of the new kind of concepts he brings up, he suggests implementing them in sort of a step by step or phase wise manner because people aren't necessarily ready for big change right away. And so by being able to take this a step at a time, and if people have problems with it, being able to talk about it and work through those problems in a sensitive manner that takes into consideration people's concerns is something that he supports very much. In particular, he suggests that an early stage of world government might just be having a world legislature where representatives from all the countries would come. They would pass laws. The laws would be enforced by the individual countries themselves. So it'd be a step. It's still a big step, but it's not a huge step. It's a little bit closer to the United Nations in some ways, although the UN doesn't have quite the authority to be able to pass laws that actually influence countries as much as they might need to. But it's certainly a model that could be used uh, in taking an initial step. After that, you see P.R. Sarkar suggesting adding some more administrative functions like overseeing a global militia. Finally, in the long term, having a government that has all of the functions of current governments. So it's a step by step process which allows people to have time to get used to it, to become accustomed to it and support it.
Yeah, that's one thing I did take note in the book. You had broken down those phases, and I thought that was really important because it's true. That's like you do need to take it sensitively, and so I thought I really appreciated that in the and the way you set up the book, kind of explaining that quite well about the phases and giving examples of what the phases would look like. I thought that was important.
Yeah, and you find this in his different discourses.
Hmm.
But it takes a little bit of time to kind of distinguish which
Yes, of course.
discourse is talking about which thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And then you talked about the authority like the UN has. What rights would be granted by a world constitution?
Well, this is interesting, and this is where you really see other elements of Pierre Sarkar's philosophy coming out. For example, there's one of his discourses is called "The Requirements of an Ideal Constitution," and the last part of that talks about a world constitution, and in fact, having in the world constitution a Bill of Rights, which gives rights to people and also to other living beings. For example, one of the rights mentioned in that particular discourse is the guarantee of protection for plants and animals. Now, that's very surprising. There's not a lot of that kind of language in constitutions nowadays. But it definitely is in line with his philosophy of neo-humanism, which says that we need to care for all of the beings of the world, including inanimate objects. You find actually some, though, inklings of this kind of movement in constitutions in South America, where they are beginning to provide rights for uh, ecological areas, for forests, for other living beings. So people are getting there. It's not quite there yet, but I think that's probably the direction that we're going to be seeing happening anyway. A second right is a one that comes more from the Kraut philosophy, which is that countries will be required to guarantee the purchasing power of their citizens sufficiently to be able to obtain the minimum necessities of life. Now, what does that mean? Basically, countries will have to guarantee people the opportunity to have jobs that pay sufficiently so that they can buy adequate and decent food, clothing, housing, medical care, education, and other necessities. Uh, you don't see that well, you see it in some places where there's efforts, but rarely do you see it really fully manifest. And this particular right, and in general, these rights are ones that people would be able to, is called justiciability, means they can hold the government accountable through courts or otherwise for, in fact, manifesting these rights. So it's not just on paper. They can sue in order to make sure that they are guaranteed these rights. There's a third set of rights, which P.R. Sarkar describes as fundamental rights, rights to spiritual practice, to cultural legacy, be able to practice one's cultural expressions, education, and indigenous linguistic expression, which means that people can talk in their own native languages. All of these things he felt were important psychologically for people. And so he recommends that they be put in the Constitution as rights. There are others, but those are the main ones.
Yeah, you're talking about the rights for animals and plants, and even though it's still I live on an island here in Hawaii, and it's still very grassroots, but there's definitely, as there's been a revival of the, indigenous culture here, there's definitely been a revival of that. And then I think us still, we see that we are this kind of in the middle of the Pacific Ocean out here. So if we don't take care of it, then yeah. And then also you talked about the linguistics. And I don't know if you know much about the history of Hawaii, but I believe the language was suppressed until I think almost the 1970s, 1980s. And I have an aunt who's Hawaiian, and they did not speak it in their home because it was illegal. So, but all their children are now in immersion programs, like all their grandchildren. I think those are all very important to important things, and I'm glad that you are bringing that to light. And I know it's a philosophy of P.R. Sarkar, but I'm so happy that you put it together in this book.
You know, on the language front, it's interesting because if you want to suppress a people, you suppress their language. And so he's saying, no more. These are guaranteed rights that can be enforced globally. And I think that that's really great.
And so you talked about the rights, and I guess it kind of leads into, it's kind of intertwined. What are some responsibilities of world government, and how would you think this would benefit people on our planet?
Sure. Well, certainly the very first one would be to guarantee the rights that we just talked about. The government is there to protect those rights for people. So that would be one. Certainly, safeguarding the peace is a big one. And we talked briefly about the idea of a world militia. To do that, and I'll mention that as a benefit in a moment. Protecting the environment, protecting people who are minorities or have been discriminated against. Also, there's an interesting element supporting economic development, but there's a very interesting dichotomy in Shrii or P.R. Sarkar's thinking on this. He says that the political aspects of government should be centralized, the policy making and so forth, but that the economic aspects associated with government should be localized. And so you don't have a central government that's dictating all how you're going to, run the economy. That's in the hands of local people who know their area the best. They know their resources the best, and they're the ones to make decisions. The world government could help if they needed resources or expertise, but the decisions about how to plan for local development and how to implement that are in the hands of local people. It's a very nice dichotomy and quite unique, I find. Now, as far as benefits go, one example of a benefit would be if you have a world militia, which is safeguarding the peace, right? If you have that, you don't have to have an army in every country. And so you don't have to spend trillions of dollars globally on having armies in case some other country's army is going to invade. So having a global militia would be something that would save tremendous amount of money that could be used for the betterment of people and other creatures. It could also lessen bloodshed happening from warfare, like in the Ukraine now, and it could lessen people's mental tensions, which could be one of the biggest long-term things, and something that would help in people's spiritual growth. Because if you're constantly fearful of you're going to be attacked or hurt, and that's a hard place to start your meditation from.
So, how would a world government be structured?
Well, we talked about it. It happens in phases. I mean, the early phase, it's just a legislature, and the countries send representatives to a legislature. It passes laws. The countries enforce the laws. Very simple. I mean, it's not an easy step, but it is fairly simple to describe. Later on, you begin to have additional administrative elements come in. The first one that Sarkar talks about is the world militia, probably because it has such a major effect on the dynamics if you take away the threat of war. I mean, just look at how globally the invasion of Ukraine has affected people, the price of grain, of oil and gas, the relationships of different countries. It has really thrown the world into a spin. And so if you can eliminate that, that has a big effect. But then beyond that, ultimately you would have a government that's very familiar in terms of the structure. There would be a legislature to pass laws, an executive body to enforce the laws, a judicial branch to interpret laws. Two things that are interesting in terms of P.R. Sarkar's view. One is he also suggests a branch of government called an audit branch, which is essentially to make sure that the money is being spent correctly. And so they review the expenditures of other branches. And then finally, there's a policy making branch separate from the legislature, which goes about making large scale policy decisions, which then a legislature can take and make laws about. And those are the two kind of new parts, an auditing branch and this high level of policy making body.
So, how would a world government be implemented?
The big question, right?
Yes.
As I said, back in the 50s, there were lots of people working on world constitutions and ideas for world government, and they have worked very hard and diligently, but have generally not gone very far. And that's because there's a lot of resistance to this idea. Some of the resistance comes from individual people who are a little scared. They think of world government as a big, scary entity. They're just not sure. There's legitimate skepticism of what is this going to do for me? So there's that. And there's also the idea that different countries have different, interests, and they may diverge from one another, which would make it harder for them to want to join together. But P.R. Sarkar says that the number one obstacle is the fear of local officials, local leaders, which at a country level or even below that, who would lose their power. Pretty classic, right? And if we had a world government, then the person on the country level is not the top, most powerful entity anymore necessarily. And so there are these obstacles that get in the way. The question is, how can they ever be overcome? Because in our world now, we have 200 different countries. They're sovereign. In other words, they run their own business for the most part. They have different economic systems, capitalist, communist, socialist. How do you get from here to there? One thing that comes to mind is that some of it may happen naturally because there are issues that are so big that no country can deal with them. Climate change. There's no single country on earth that can deal with this issue. So they try to come together through treaties and through the United Nations and everything. But you find that that's not really effective. They don't move fast enough. They don't move boldly enough. They can't stop a war in Europe. How in the world in the 21st century can the world's, countries not get together and stop a war in Europe? It's unbelievable. That's because they don't have enough power in place to be able to do that. Yet, I think that some of these issues are going to force people to begin to think beyond just my country better than the rest. Beyond that, I think that Pierre Sarkar himself believed that people can make a difference and that people who want to foster world government can mutually cooperate. That's important to work together because it's a big job. They can focus on doing constructive, service-oriented types of work as opposed to getting bogged down in politics. He found that wasn't the best way. It's not that you can't ever contest an election, but helping people directly will be more effective. And that over time, people who want to support the idea of a world government, of a global family, will gain the support of people by serving people. And when they advocate for the idea of world government, there'll be some places in the world that will support them. And it's like, yeah, that makes great sense. Let's go ahead with it. And there'll be some countries that resist. And the suggestion from Pierre Sarkar is that the places that resist, the people who want it, will become agitated. And they will eventually force their governments to accept this idea of a world government. Now, that may be a while in the future, but it's hard to read the future, how big the crises will be. If the climate change crisis becomes really big, some of these forces will move ahead faster than others. You can already see among young people, they know that their future is severely jeopardized by the inability of current governments, even working together to really address climate change in a sufficient manner to save the world. And so you will find that people will become more advocates, I think, as they see the current systems really are not going to work on these big problems. There's also one other thing, and that is that Pierre Sarkar advocated the creation of new kinds of leaders who are strongly connected to spiritual practices, to morality, and to service for all people. He called these types of leaders sadvipuras. true intellectuals. But the idea of creating these kind of people whose morality allows them to be seen as having high integrity, as being service oriented, they will be highly respected because of the way they conduct themselves. That these kind of people can be sort of harbingers of this changing of the world's opinion about world government and other related ideas. And that the development of more and more of these types of people is really quite crucial in the implementation of world government and ultimately in running the world government, because you need moral people to be able to make sure that the government serves everyone rather than just the people who are in the government.
I've met some incredibly credible young people through my time with planetary leadership training, and they do have this awareness that I did not have so much at the age of 20 or 21. What are some things we can do to establish a world, to help our governments right now to put ourselves on that path?
Morality is key. It is essential, regardless of whether it's the world government or a city government, a village government. Morality is key in making sure that government works for the people. And what we have seen a lot of in the last decade is a lot of immorality, and it has caused innumerable problems. You know, creating divisions among people, create confusion among people, misinformation. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that's been happening because of the lack of morality. So for people who might be attending this course, one thing I can suggest is to improve your own spiritual practice and your own practice of morality, reflecting on it, strengthening yourself. That's a big step forward. Doing service for other people, another big step forward. And also learning more about the key issues of the day, which is not easy in a world of misinformation, right? But that requires study, conversation, thoughtful conversation with other people, and also an interesting concept that Pierre Sarkar talks about in his book on the liberation of intellect, NeoHumanism, which is called awakened conscience. You study, you reflect on an issue, and then ultimately you begin to ask yourself, if we do this policy, will it benefit people or not? If it does, then you're more likely to accept it. If it doesn't benefit people, forget it. Awakened conscience, being able to reflect on whether or not issues are benefiting the greater group of people. That's a real key. So that would be on an individual basis. On a sort of larger basis, I would say supporting leaders who represent these kind of values. There are not a lot, but there are some. Find those, support them, and also begin to share the ideas that you have with others. And this is ultimately building up a critical mass of people who have a sense for what is important, what is valuable. And so by sharing some of these ideas with others, that will help grow that critical mass. And I suspect that nowadays there's multiple ways of doing it, and certainly one of which is the course like you are doing.
It is difficult with all the misinformation, but I think it's important that we do also spread the word or share the story. I think that's important too. I think I'm still finding my voice. I have this spiritual awakening and this conscious awakening, but sometimes finding my voice and going, it's a challenge. So that's definitely something that I'm working on. So I appreciate you reflecting and reminding how important that is as we move forward.
Based on my life, the first 50 years are the toughest. After that, it's
So you written this book. What inspired you to write this book? I know you talked a little bit about that in the beginning,
yeah.
but
I
if you
mean,
could.
I was in the 1980s, I was just I really wanted to find something that could be mine. That it's something I could do to benefit people. And in 1990, I got a message from Pierre Sarkar that suggested write a constitution based on my ideas. And as soon as I heard it, it was like, that's it. And so I've been working on it ever since.
That's a powerful message.
It was a great message. Very
Yeah,
exciting.
it's a wonderful message. You've written the book. What do you hope readers will get out of this book?
I hope that they will understand more deeply the what Pierre Sarkar's vision of world government and world constitution is, because it has an important role to play in the evolution of a more progressive society to the implementation of ideas of Prout and neo-humanism. And I put a lot of, there's over 500 footnotes in the book leading to specific discourses that Pierre Sarkar gave about various topics. And I did that because I wanted people to be able to go and read what he had to say about these things, just so that they could have a better, deeper understanding of it. Because people don't know so much about this aspect of his philosophy, but I think it will become more and more important. So why not now?
After finishing and completing the book, you were successful with me on that one, and I definitely appreciate all the footnotes. There's one young member of ours in India, and he's always looking for that kind of direction, that kind of, so that's a great resource. Thank
Cool.
you.
Very
So what was the most satisfying part of working on this project?
Certainly being able to do something that I had received encouragement from Pierre Sarkar himself. But beyond that, I was able to reach out to lots of different people who follow Pierre Sarkar, whether in the spiritual practices or in the social philosophy. And about 40 different people from around the world gave feedback and help on creating the book. And it was just so nice. I mean, probably half of them or more, I didn't know before. And so it was lovely having that kind of interaction, probably not unlike the interaction in the PLT course, where people didn't know someone, and all of a sudden you got a family together. So that was really quite nice.
That is so inspiring. There is such a beauty to that. Absolutely. Yeah. I can completely agree and appreciate that with you. So that's fantastic. Is there anything else you would like to add that I didn't ask or that we didn't get to cover today?
No, I'd say you did a 5-star job of interviewing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to share this with everyone and to hopefully inspire people to get the book and to read it and also to take action, because I think that's the thing that is the most inspiring. And I think this book really gave you that framework. Like you said, it did kind of connect some things that maybe were not so connected, and I also learned a lot of new things. So gave me kind of a path. So
Well, Christian Prema, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And it's nice to have spent some time with you.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wonderful.